Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of the murder Father Brown predicted, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Father Brown predicts a murder. The murder has already happened, Father Brown whispered, though not a single body had yet been found, nor a scream heard in the quiet English village. His words hung in the air like a curse, making those around him glance nervously over their shoulders, as though the crime might be waiting for them just beyond the churchyard wall. It was not a guess, nor a dramatic turn of phrase. He said it with the serene finality of a man who knew something dreadful was inevitable, as though fate itself had already written the name of the victim in blood. The afternoon had begun as a simple gathering. The villagers had come together for tea at the rectory garden, smiling politely, exchanging gossip, the air scented with roses and warm scones. Yet in the middle of the chatter, Father Brown's small, round figure sat unnervingly still, his eyes hidden under his hat, his face shadowed by an expression that seemed almost funereal. He listened to the harmless laughter around him, but what he heard was not harmless. It was layered with unspoken resentments, hidden rivalries, and the bitterness of secrets kept too long. In every smile he saw a sneer. In every handshake he heard a threat. And then, without warning, he said it. A murder would happen before the week was through. The laughter died instantly. A spoon clattered against a teacup. A woman gave a short, high-pitched laugh, but her voice cracked, betraying her unease. "Father Brown, surely you jest," one of the men said, forcing a smile, but his hands tightened on his chair as though bracing himself. Yet Father Brown simply lowered his head, murmuring, "It is not a jest, my child. It is a certainty." The room changed after that. What had been light conversation turned into a suffocating silence. People who once sat close now leaned away from one another. Every word seemed weighted, every glance suspicious. If there was to be a murder, then who would be the victim? And more dangerously, who among them was already a killer in waiting? That night, Father Brown walked alone through the village, his soft steps echoing on cobblestones slick with rain. The lantern light caught his face, showing no trace of doubt. He stopped outside the window of the public house, where voices carried late into the night. He heard the villagers speaking about him, about his prediction. Some mocked him. Others whispered nervously, saying that he must have some knowledge he wasn't sharing. But one voice, low, trembling, yet sharp, cut through the rest. "If he already knows," the speaker muttered, "then perhaps he knows too much." The priest's heart sank, not from fear, but from recognition. Those words carried with them a deeper shadow. The killer was already afraid of being discovered. Fear in a guilty man often leads to haste, and haste is deadlier than patience. The days that followed stretched like an ever-tightening noose. The villagers watched one another with suspicion. Old grudges resurfaced. Friends became wary. Neighbors shut their doors earlier in the evening. And all the while, Father Brown seemed to wander aimlessly, peering into shops, lingering by hedges, his presence both a comfort and an accusation. He said little, but when he did speak, his words carried an uncanny weight. Once, as a young man passed him by, Father Brown looked him in the eye and said gently, "You must not let your anger lead you where you cannot return." The boy blanched, as though the priest had peered straight into the dark knot of rage knotted in his heart. Then came the first sign that his prophecy was not a fantasy. On the third evening, a scream pierced the village square, a scream that froze every villager where they stood. But when they rushed to its source, no body lay on the ground, no blood stained the earth. Only a broken wine glass and the faint smell of smoke clung to the air. The woman who screamed insisted she had seen someone standing in the shadows with a knife, watching her through her window, but when the men searched, they found nothing. Some dismissed it as hysteria. Others whispered that Father Brown had been right. The killer was circling, waiting. What made it worse, what made it unbearable, was that Father Brown said nothing to calm them. Instead, he looked at the broken glass and said softly, "The knife was real. It was not the shadow you should fear, but the silence after it." The villagers did not understand. Perhaps they did not want to. But his words planted terror deeper in their hearts. On the fourth day, the weather turned foul. Thunder rolled across the sky, and the rain came down in thick, relentless sheets. That evening, Father Brown entered the inn, dripping wet, and sat at the corner table. The villagers huddled near the fire, speaking in whispers, but fell quiet as he entered. He ordered nothing, only sat silently, gazing at them with his round, childlike eyes that seemed far too knowing. It was then that he spoke again, his voice low, but carrying clearly through the hushed room. "I have seen the mark of Cain. The one who will strike is among us tonight." The silence that followed was unbearable. A man dropped his mug. A woman pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The villagers looked at one another, searching faces, searching for guilt. But Father Brown's eyes never lingered long enough on any one person for them to know. It was as though everyone in that room carried the weight of suspicion. And then the first big revelation came, not with blood, but with words. A letter was found, slipped under the church door. It was unsigned, written in a hurried, desperate scrawl. "He will not stop me. He thinks he sees everything, but he does not see the truth. By the time he speaks my name, it will be too late." The letter was read aloud, and gasps echoed through the pews. Some said it was a cruel joke. Others said it was proof that Father Brown had truly stirred the devil's work into motion. But Father Brown himself only bowed his head, as if in sorrow. "This is not a confession," he murmured. "It is a warning. The hand that wrote it trembles not with guilt, but with determination." From that moment, the village was no longer a home, but a trap. Every glance felt poisoned. Every conversation dripped with menace. Husbands doubted wives, and friends avoided each other's eyes. And always, Father Brown walked quietly among them, as though waiting for the inevitable to surface. On the sixth night, it nearly did. A shot rang out in the dark, shattering windows in the rectory garden. The villagers rushed to the scene, finding nothing but a smoking revolver abandoned on the grass. No blood, no body, just the chilling knowledge that someone had come within inches of carrying out Father Brown's grim prediction. Yet the priest remained unshaken. He bent, picked up the revolver, and held it in his hand as though it were a sacred object. His lips moved silently in prayer, but when he finally spoke, His voice cut through the rain-heavy air. "It is not the one who pulls the trigger you should fear. It is the one who places the weapon where another's hand will find it." The crowd stared at him, wide-eyed, their minds spinning with confusion. Who could he mean? Who had planted the weapon? Was the shooter the killer, or merely a pawn in someone else's game? The questions multiplied faster than answers could come, and the villagers' fear deepened into something close to madness. By the seventh day, no one slept. Lanterns burned late into the night in every window. Locks were checked twice, thrice. The entire village seemed to be holding its breath. And still, Father Brown said the same words over and over again to whoever would listen. "The murder has already happened. You simply have not seen the body yet." And then, when they were at the edge of breaking, he spoke one final, devastating line. Standing at the pulpit on Sunday morning, his voice heavy with sorrow, he looked out at the weary, terrified congregation and said, "I know who will die. I know who will kill. But I cannot tell you, for if I speak it aloud, more than one life will be lost." The congregation erupted in gasps, some shouting, some weeping. And then silence, an unbearable, suffocating silence. And that is where the mystery hangs, like a noose waiting to drop. The question that none dared ask aloud burned in every mind. If Father Brown already knew the victim and the killer, then why would he not stop it? Why would he let the murder unfold, like a shadow stretching toward them all? The answer, if there was one, remained locked behind his sorrowful eyes. And somewhere in that church, among the terrified faces, sat the killer, waiting for their moment. The murder had already begun. Chapter 2. The Deadly Secret Father Brown. "The dead man's secret is not that he is dead," Father Brown said softly, his voice carrying like a thunderclap in the hushed parish hall, "but that his death was never meant for him." The silence that followed was so dense it seemed to crush the air out of the room. Faces turned pale, hearts raced, and even those who had come simply to satisfy idle curiosity suddenly wished they had stayed far away. Because in that single sentence, Father Brown had suggested something unthinkable, that the village had not only suffered a murder, but that the real victim still walked among them, unaware that death was stalking them step by step. The night had begun in an unsettling calm. Rain had slicked the cobblestones, and the only sounds were the distant hoot of an owl and the hiss of wet leaves against the wind. But by dawn, the body had been discovered. It was found at the edge of the village pond, face down, the reflection of the grey sky trembling above his lifeless form. No weapon, no struggle, just silence and the weight of unanswered questions. He was not a stranger, nor a beloved figure, merely a quiet man whose life had gone unnoticed, which was precisely why his death felt so wrong. Why him? Why now? And why in such a place? The villagers gathered in uneasy clusters, whispering accusations and theories, every eye flicking toward Father Brown for comfort or explanation. But instead of calming them, he unsettled them more. He stood at the body, holding his umbrella like a cross, his gaze piercing through the layers of circumstance. "This man did not die for his sins," he murmured, "but for someone else's." The words slipped into their minds like poison. It was no longer a mystery about one man's death. It was about an invisible web of deceit, where anyone could be the true intended victim. From that moment, fear spread like wildfire. Every villager felt the gaze of the killer upon them. Husbands suspected wives, sisters distrusted brothers, and even lifelong friends refused to meet each other's eyes. At night, windows were bolted, and no footsteps dared to echo after dark. But Father Brown, instead of staying within the safety of the rectory, walked deeper into the shadows of the village, searching, not for the killer, but for the truth the dead man had carried with him. The more he searched, the darker the path became. The man who had died had kept a locked box beneath the floorboards of his cottage. Inside, Father Brown found not money nor trinkets, but letters, dozens of them, each one unsigned, written in the same hurried hand. The words were cryptic, fragments of threats and promises that seemed half-coded, half insane. You will pay for what was taken. Blood is owed, and blood will answer. The secret cannot rest in one pair of hands. When Father Brown read these words aloud, the villagers gasped and muttered, their minds leaping toward hidden feuds, ancient grudges, and forgotten scandals. But the priest only frowned. This is not a feud, he said. This is a design, and the hand that wrote these letters is not done yet. His words offered no resolution, only more dread. The turning point came when Father Brown uncovered something that made even him hesitate. In the dead man's pocket, he found a small scrap of cloth, torn and stained faintly with what looked like rust or blood. But what unsettled him most was not the stain, but the symbol sewn into the fabric. A cross, black and jagged, the kind of emblem one would expect to see on a flag of war, not hidden in the coat of a villager. When he held it up to the light, the room fell silent. This is not just a murder, he whispered. This is a warning, and it was not meant for him. The villagers pressed him, demanding to know what he meant, but Father Brown refused to say more. He walked away, leaving them reeling in terror, each of them suspecting that they had been marked by this strange, unspoken secret. That night, the tavern erupted in arguments. Some said the priest was protecting someone. Others claimed he knew too much and was toying with them. But one voice, drunk with fear, said the words everyone dreaded. If Father Brown already knows the secret, then perhaps he is the one keeping it deadly. And then the first shocking revelation surfaced. A witness, an old woman, blind in one eye and half mad with grief, claimed she had seen the dead man days before his death, standing in the churchyard, arguing, with a figure cloaked in black. She said their voices had risen to shouts, and that she heard the dead man cry out, "You'll never make me carry this alone." But when she looked again, the figure was gone, vanished like smoke. The villagers shuddered at her story. Who was the figure? What burden had the man been forced to carry? Was it the same burden that had now led to his murder? Father Brown listened intently, but when pressed, he gave no answer. Instead, he only repeated the words that sent chills into every heart. The man did not die for what he carried, but for what he refused to carry any longer. By now, paranoia gripped the entire village. Every locked door seemed flimsy. Every shadow held menace. And just when they thought the mystery could grow no darker, Father Brown uncovered yet another layer. Behind the altar in the church, hidden within a crack in the stone, he found a folded parchment so old it crumbled in his fingers. On it was written a single sentence in Latin: "The one who speaks the secret dies by the secret." When he read it aloud, the villagers recoiled, as though the words themselves were cursed. Some fled the church, others wept. But Father Brown stood still, staring at the ancient ink, his face pale. "This is not superstition," he murmured. "This is law, and it is still being obeyed." That was the moment when reality itself seemed to tilt. If the secret was so dangerous that even speaking it meant death, then what had the dead man uncovered? And, worse, what had Father Brown now uncovered by reading those words? The villagers began to fear not just the killer, but Father Brown himself, for perhaps he too now bore the deadly secret, and by knowing it, had placed everyone in peril. On the seventh night, the tension exploded. Another scream split the village, and this time, when the crowd rushed to the square, they found a knife buried in the church door. A single word was carved into the wood beside it: silence. No one knew if it was a command, a threat, or a plea. But Father Brown touched the hilt of the knife, and for the first time, his hand trembled. The villagers demanded answers, but he gave them only more shadows. "The one who holds the secret is not the one you fear," he said, his voice low and broken, "but the one you trust most." Those words fell like a death sentence. Eyes turned wildly. Suspicion tore families apart, and no one slept. It was no longer about the dead man at the pond. It was about a truth so poisonous that it threatened to consume them all. And then, the cliffhanger no one expected. At midnight, as the storm raged and the villagers barricaded themselves indoors, Father Brown stood alone at the pulpit. His voice was steady, but his words shattered every heart. "I know the secret. I know who carries it, and I know who will kill to keep it hidden. But if I reveal it, this village will bury more than one body." And with that, he fell silent, his eyes heavy with sorrow, as though he carried the weight of the world upon his small shoulders. The church bells tolled midnight, and in the echo of their sound, the villagers realized the truth was too dangerous to bear. Somewhere in that storm-lashed village, the killer smiled in the shadows. The deadly secret had not been buried with the dead man. It had only just begun to breathe. Chapter 3: Father Brown foresees a killer. "The killer is already in this room," Father Brown said, his voice low but unshakable, and in that instant, every breath in the parish hall turned shallow, every hand froze mid-gesture, every pair of eyes darted wildly as though the words themselves had summoned death among them. No one moved, no one spoke. They were all trapped in the chilling certainty that one of them, someone they knew, someone they trusted, was already a murderer in waiting. It began with an unease that no one could name. For days, the village had felt smothered beneath an atmosphere too heavy to dismiss, like a thunderstorm waiting to break. Whispers spread of strange behavior, doors left unlocked, figures glimpsed in the mist when no one should have been walking the lanes. And in the middle of it all was Father Brown, small and unassuming, yet carrying the dreadful weight of knowledge in his eyes. He seemed to see more than he should, more than anyone dared admit. And when he stood before the villagers and said those words, they felt their world tilt into terror. The villagers tried to laugh it off at first, though their laughter was hollow. "A figure of speech, Father, surely?" one man asked, his hands twitching as though restless for something hidden. Father Brown merely shook his head. "No speech, no figure. I tell you plainly, I have foreseen the hand that will strike, and it belongs to someone here." He did not point, he did not accuse, but the power of suggestion was enough. Every person present suddenly wore the shadow of guilt in the eyes of their neighbors. From that moment, suspicion began to rot the air. A woman clutched her child tighter, stepping away from the group. Men who had drunk together at the inn now kept distance, their faces tense with distrust. One boy, barely 17, wept openly, swearing he had done nothing Though no one had accused him, fear had made them all guilty, and that guilt was precisely the soil in which the killer thrived. But Father Brown's prophecy was not mere theater. Soon enough, the signs of danger became undeniable. A knife was discovered, left upon the church steps, gleaming and wet, though whether from rain or blood, no one could say. It bore no fingerprints, no trace of its owner, but scratched into the blade was a single word: soon. The villagers recoiled, some crying out, some insisting it was a cruel prank. But Father Brown stared at the blade with sorrow. "This is not a threat," he murmured. "It is a confession." The villagers pressed him for answers. Who had he foreseen? How could he know? But Father Brown only shook his head, refusing to name a soul. "To speak the name," he said softly, "is to sign the death warrant of another." His refusal struck them harder than any accusation could have, because now not only was there a killer among them, but Father Brown himself carried a secret too terrible to reveal. In the days that followed, paranoia curdled into dread. Baker swore he saw someone watching his house at midnight. The innkeeper claimed to hear footsteps pacing his hallway when all his guests were asleep. Children woke screaming from nightmares of a faceless man standing at the foot of their beds. And in the quiet, when the village tried to carry on, Father Brown seemed to linger like a ghost, his round frame appearing suddenly at corners, his eyes watching, always watching. It was not comfort he gave them. It was the reminder that something monstrous lurked too close for escape. The first big reveal came not in blood, but in words that struck harder. A letter appeared, nailed to the church door during the stormy night. The handwriting was jagged, furious, as if written in a frenzy. "I am already chosen. He sees me, but he will not stop me. The sin is mine to bear, and it will be answered in blood." The villagers trembled as the letter was read aloud, the words echoing in their minds. Someone had already accepted the role of murderer. But who? Father Brown's expression darkened. He turned away from the letter, as if ashamed. "It is not madness that writes these words," he whispered, "but conviction. And conviction is far more dangerous than madness." That was worse than anything else he could have said. Madness might have been random, uncontrollable, but conviction meant reason, purpose, a design so complete that nothing could turn it aside. By the fifth night, the village was breaking under the pressure. Families slept in separate rooms. Doors were barred, windows shuttered. Yet even locked doors could not keep out fear. One woman swore she heard a whisper outside her door, "You are not the one." Another found a crude cross scratched into her window pane, the lines so deep the glass threatened to shatter. The villagers no longer asked if a murder would happen, but when. Father Brown, however, moved through this chaos with a calm that infuriated some and terrified others. He stopped a man in the street and told him quietly, "You must not walk home alone tonight." Hours later, the man was found trembling by the roadside, claiming a figure had followed him through the darkness, matching his every step until the road split. Another time, Father Brown warned a woman to keep her children close, and that very evening a stranger's toy was discovered left on their doorstep. The more he foresaw, the deeper the terror grew, because if Father Brown could predict where danger would fall, then surely he could also predict the killer's identity. But still, he kept silent, and his silence became unbearable. The villagers confronted him, demanding the truth. He stood in the pulpit, his face pale, his hands gripping the wood as though anchoring himself against the storm of their voices. "If I tell you," he said, "then not one death will stain this village, but many. For the killer is not only a person. The killer is what you carry in your hearts. And if I speak the name, you will all strike like wolves, and the blood will not stop at one." His words silenced them, but the silence was worse than shouting. Because now they did not only fear the unknown killer, they feared themselves. The story should have ended there, but it deepened into madness. Another clue appeared, hidden in the rectory garden. A child found it while playing. A pocket watch, cracked, its glass face smeared faintly with something dark. On the back was engraved a message that chilled them all. "When it stops, so will a life." The watch's hands were frozen at midnight. When Father Brown held it in his palm, his lips trembled. "This was not left for me," he said. "It was left for the one I will not name. The killer leaves gifts, as though courting their victim." No one spoke, but every eye turned upon every other. Because now, not only was there a killer, they were taunting the one they intended to strike, and the victim, whoever they were, walked unknowingly among them. By the seventh day, the pressure was unbearable. Sleep had abandoned the village. Torches burned all night. Families huddled together, afraid of shadows. The killer's presence was not seen, not heard, but felt, a constant suffocating weight pressing on every chest. And Father Brown, the only man who seemed to know the truth, became both savior and accuser, prophet and curse. His every word, his every glance, cut deeper into their fraying sanity. The cliffhanger came like the toll of a funeral bell. On Sunday morning, as the villagers gathered in the church, their faces drawn, their bodies weary, Father Brown rose to speak. His voice was steady, though his eyes were full of sorrow. "I have seen the killer's face. I know the moment they will strike. I know the hand that will hold the weapon, and the blood that will be spilled. But I cannot stop it. For if I speak the truth, then the killer will not act alone. Others will join them, and the death you fear will become a death you cannot count." Gasps rippled through the church. Some cried, some shouted, some fell to their knees. The villagers were left trapped in a horror worse than ignorance. The horror of knowing that the killer was already chosen, already foreseen, and that the man who might save them had bound himself to silence. And as the bells tolled above, echoing through the fearful congregation, Father Brown lowered his head and whispered so softly that only those closest could hear. "The killer has been foreseen, and when it happens, you will not ask who, but why." And with that, the church fell into a silence more dreadful than any scream, because they knew the prophecy would not be broken. The killer was already among them, and the moment of death was already written. Chapter 4. The Prophecy. Father Brown hid. The prophecy was not about the killer, Father Brown said quietly, his voice trembling with a weight no one could measure. It was about the one who will die, knowing the killer's name. The words fell like a hammer blow in the silence of the rectory, and the villagers stared at him as though he had just cursed them all. Not a sound stirred, not a breath moved, and in that suffocating stillness came the dreadful realization. If Father Brown was telling the truth, then the real terror was not merely the murder to come, but the secret he had hidden, a prophecy so damning that even speaking it aloud could doom an innocent soul. It had begun in whispers. Father Brown was not himself. For days he had walked the lanes of the village at odd hours, muttering prayers beneath his breath, his round, familiar figure shrinking beneath the shadow of some unseen burden. He no longer smiled at the children who ran past the church. He no longer lingered over tea with the townsfolk. Instead, he spent long hours in the confessional, though no one had entered, his lips moving silently, his face pale. When he emerged, his eyes carried something that chilled those who met them. Not fear, not sorrow, but knowledge. Knowledge so dark, it made them recoil. The problem announced itself on a Sunday morning, though no one dared call it by name. The congregation gathered, restless, uneasy. The church smelled faintly of candle wax and rain, but beneath it was another scent, sharp, metallic, like iron. When Father Brown stepped to the pulpit, his hands trembled as though the very words he was about to speak would tear the world apart. He looked upon them, not with comfort, but with warning. "A prophecy was given," he said slowly, "and I have hidden it from you. I hid it because the words are not a warning. They are a trap, and those who hear them cannot escape." The villagers shifted uneasily. A prophecy, hidden by their own priest? The idea felt blasphemous, terrifying. Some laughed nervously, but their laughter faltered under his gaze, for Father Brown's eyes carried no jest. He continued in a voice that seemed too heavy for the small man who bore it. "The prophecy does not speak of salvation. It does not speak of hope. It speaks only of death and of betrayal." From that moment, the village changed. Every whisper carried the weight of doom. Every look lingered too long, questioning. People no longer trusted one another, but worse, they no longer trusted Father Brown. For if he had hidden a prophecy, if he had kept it from them, then perhaps he was not their protector at all, but their jailer, holding the key to their fate and refusing to turn it. The suspense deepened when the first sign of the prophecy's power revealed itself. In the dead man's abandoned cottage, still left untouched after his mysterious death, Father Brown found a page torn from an ancient journal. Its ink was faded, the words barely legible, but what remained chilled him. It read, "The priest will know, he will see the name, and the one he tells will not live to speak again." Father Brown folded the page silently and tucked it into his coat. When the villagers asked what he had found, he told them only, "It is better you do not see." His secrecy fanned their fear into frenzy. What could be written that their priest himself dared not reveal? Days passed, each one darker than the last. The villagers swore they heard voices in the night, calling their names. Doors that were locked were found open in the morning. At the tavern, someone claimed they saw Father Brown standing in the lane at midnight, staring at a house, whispering prayers into the rain. But when they went to confront him, he was gone, leaving only the sound of bells that had never been rung. The first big reveal came when one of the villagers, drunk with fear and anger, broke into the rectory. He claimed he had seen Father Brown hide something beneath the altar. When others followed, they discovered a sealed envelope, addressed not to any one person, but to the one who will ask. Their hands shook as they held it. Some urged it to be burned. Others demanded it be opened. But before they could decide, Father Brown himself appeared, his face pale, his eyes blazing with sorrow. He snatched the envelope from their hands and said, "If you open this, you will not live long enough to regret it." The villagers cried out, demanding to know what was inside, but Father Brown would not say. His silence left them reeling in terror, because now not only was there a prophecy, but it had been written down, locked away, deliberately hidden from their eyes. And if Father Brown feared it enough to keep it sealed, what horror did it contain? The weight of the hidden prophecy began to crush the village. Families turned against one another, each believing the other was somehow tied to the priest's silence. The butcher's wife claimed she saw Father Brown watching her husband with tears in his eyes, and she screamed that it meant her husband was the killer, or the victim. The blacksmith swore that when Father Brown shook his hand, he muttered, "Forgive me," and from then on, he refused to leave his home. Fear bred madness, and madness bled into violence. But the true terror struck when Father Brown himself, weary and broken, whispered to one villager in confession, "I have seen the name." The villager stumbled out, pale as death, refusing to speak a word of what he had heard. By morning, he was dead, his body found at the edge of the graveyard. No mark upon him, no weapon, no struggle. Only his eyes, wide and staring, filled with the horror of something unspeakable. The village reeled. The prophecy was true. The priest had spoken the name, and the one who heard it had not lived to tell. Panic overtook them. Who was next? Who carried the mark of death in their heart? And worst of all, why would Father Brown keep the prophecy hidden if it was killing them one by one? By the seventh day, the tension was unbearable. No one slept. Lamps burned all night. Shadows leapt across the walls, and every sound was mistaken for footsteps, creeping closer. The villagers gathered in the church, demanding Father Brown reveal everything. He stood before them, shaking, his face hollow with grief. "If I reveal it," he said, "the prophecy will consume you all, for it is not the killer's name you fear, it is your own." Gasps tore through the congregation. His words struck like lightning. Could the prophecy name them all? Could it mean that every soul in the village was marked for death, one way or another? The cliffhanger came like a dagger in the dark. Father Brown lifted the sealed envelope high, his hand trembling. "The prophecy is here," he whispered. "I have hidden it, because if I open it, the truth will not only reveal the killer, it will bind the rest of you to their fate. I know who it names, I know what it means, and I know that if I speak it aloud, more than one of you will not see the dawn." The church erupted in cries, some begging him to burn it, others demanding to hear. But Father Brown only lowered his head, his small frame seeming to collapse beneath the burden of silence. And then, in a voice so low it seemed almost meant for himself alone, he said, "I know who it is. I know what will be done. But the prophecy will never be told. Because if it is, the death you fear will not stop at one. It will spread until there is nothing left of this village but ashes." And with those words, the bells above tolled, though no one had touched the rope. Their echoes filled the church, filled the hearts of the trembling congregation, and left them with one truth more terrible than any death. The prophecy was real. It had already begun, and it was still hidden, waiting to claim them all. Chapter 5. Father Brown's vision turns deadly. They found Father Brown standing alone in the darkened chapel, his hands trembling around the edges of the altar, whispering words that chilled those who overheard them. "I have seen the death before it happens, and it will be by a hand no one suspects." The silence that followed his pronouncement was suffocating, as though the air itself recoiled in terror. From that moment, it was no longer a question of whether a crime would be committed, but when and by whom, and whether anyone could survive what he had already foreseen. The mystery began as a whisper, drifting through the parish, like smoke from a fire no one could quite locate. Someone had spoken of a dream, a vision Father Brown could not shake, a vision in which death seeped through the walls of the village, unseen, but inevitable. Unlike most dreams, this one left scars on his waking mind, details so precise, so cruelly exact, that even he began to fear whether he had glimpsed a future no prayer could undo. Yet he spoke of it only in fragments, as though uttering the whole would summon the horror closer. Those who caught his words found themselves unable to sleep at night, hearing echoes of something unexplainable, waiting for the invisible clock to strike the hour of doom. And yet nothing was simple. The case was not a matter of blood spilled in the open, or a body found in a locked room. It was worse. It was the promise of death, the certainty that it was coming, and the impossible question of how Father Brown knew. Every person became a suspect because every person seemed vulnerable to the prophecy. Some villagers claimed he had seen the killer's face. Others whispered that he knew the victim's name but refused to speak it. The parish, once bound by trust, began to collapse into suspicion. Each man and woman looking over their shoulder, asking in silence, "Am I the one?" The suspense tightened like a noose when Father Brown uncovered a pattern hidden within the lives of those around him. A letter found half-burned in the sacristy, a cryptic phrase muttered by a dying old woman, the peculiar glance between two supposed friends in the market, all threads in a tapestry darker than anyone wanted to admit. Yet the more he revealed, the less it made sense. Each clue pointed in several directions at once, like roads leading into a forest, with no end. Every discovery only deepened the confusion, and Father Brown himself seemed burdened by a knowledge that threatened to unhinge him. Then came the first big reveal, a moment that silenced the very breath of the village. He announced, without hesitation, that the death he foresaw had already begun, not as a single act of violence, but as a chain of events set in motion long ago. A betrayal buried in the past, a debt unpaid, a curse carried like an invisible brand upon the soul of one among them. It was not merely murder he predicted, it was retribution, a balancing of scales that none of them could stop. With those words, the ground shifted under every listener's feet. Who among them carried the curse? Who was destined to kill or be killed? And how could Father Brown know with such certainty, unless he himself bore some part in the design? From that moment, nothing could be trusted. Friends eyed each other with suspicion. Lovers whispered accusations in the dark. Every innocent gesture seemed to carry a shadow, every conversation a hidden threat. Father Brown walked among them, calm but weary, as though bearing the weight of secrets too terrible to speak aloud. At night, some swore they saw him staring into the graveyard, lips moving in prayer or in warning. Others claimed he was writing names in his notebook, scratching them out, rewriting them, as though struggling to decide who lived and who died. The story pressed forward with unbearable tension, and then, just when the villagers thought they could endure no more, a second revelation struck like thunder. Father Brown hinted that the killer was not only someone they knew, but someone who had already been marked in his vision with unmistakable clarity. Yet, when asked directly, he refused to name the person. His silence was worse than any answer could have been, because it forced everyone to look inward and wonder, could it be me? Could I be the one destined to kill, or am I already condemned to be the victim? And so the mystery coiled tighter, suffocating those who dared to think too long about it. People stopped, attending the evening service. Doors were bolted before sunset. The streets grew silent as dread consumed them all, and Father Brown himself seemed haunted, as though the vision that plagued him had begun to blur the line between reality and something far darker. He confessed to one close confidant that the vision had changed, become sharper, more detailed, but also more unbearable. He claimed he could now hear the sound of footsteps in his dream, slow and deliberate, followed by the sound of a voice he could almost recognize, a voice that whispered, "I was always meant to do this." By now, the village could no longer distinguish between prophecy and madness. Was Father Brown warning them of a crime yet to come, or was his own mind unraveling beneath the strain of secrets only he understood? The deeper he dug, the more twisted the motives became. Affairs hidden for decades, lies told to protect reputations, rivalries disguised as friendship, all spilled into the open, like wounds that refused to heal. And still, the killer remained unseen, a shadow hovering just beyond comprehension. The cliffhanger arrived in a storm of terror. On the night the prophecy seemed destined to reach its climax, Father Brown was seen standing beneath the ancient oak in the churchyard, rain falling hard against his cassock. He raised his hand and declared, "The killer is already here. The vision is not a warning. It is the truth unfolding." But before he could finish, a scream tore through the night, and the entire village froze. The scream did not belong to a stranger. It came from someone every soul in the parish knew, someone who should have been safe, someone who could not possibly be touched by the prophecy. Yet they had been touched, and the vision had turned real. The final scene lingered in unbearable silence. Father Brown closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he spoke softly, almost in sorrow. "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." His words hung in the air, refusing to fade, leaving every listener with the same question. Had he saved them by keeping the secret, or doomed them all to live under a prophecy that could never be undone? Chapter 6. A Murder, Foretold by Father. The first thing Father Brown said that night was not a prayer, but a prophecy of death, naming the victim before the murder had even been committed. The words fell into the room like a curse. The villagers, gathered tightly in the low-lit parlor of the inn, stared at the priest with expressions caught between disbelief and terror. Father Brown, quiet and pale, had spoken with such certainty that no one could dismiss it as a slip of the tongue or a dramatic warning. He had said it plainly, as if reading aloud from a book that had already been written, the name trembling in the air like smoke that could never be pulled back into the fire. And the dreadful weight of it was that everyone in the room knew the person he had named. It was not the kind of mystery that began with a body, nor with suspicion whispered behind closed doors. It began instead with a forecast of doom, a declaration that tomorrow, or perhaps even tonight, someone among them would not live to see the sunrise. And what made it unbearable was that no one could tell if Father Brown had seen this fate through divine insight, or if he had, in his simple but piercing way, uncovered something so sinister and human that the truth now hung visibly in the room. From that instant, fear grew like ivy in the corners of the inn. People looked at one another, not as friends, but as possible murderers. They glanced at the named victim, who now shifted uncomfortably in their seat, as though already watching a condemned soul. And the victim themselves, pale and trembling, demanded to know how Father Brown could possibly make such a claim. But the priest gave no answer that satisfied anyone. He simply bowed his head and muttered, "Because it is already written." The night should have continued with laughter and wine, but instead, the room stiffened into silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Each tick felt like a step toward the grave. Every shadow seemed longer than it should, every sound in the rafters sharper than expected. The villagers began whispering, arguing and accusing, not against Father Brown, but against one another. If a murder was foretold, then surely someone among them already carried the intent. The tension was unbearable. One man bolted from the inn, declaring that he would not wait to see what death had been predicted. Another sat with his back to the wall, his hand on his pocket-knife, convinced that if he was the accused, he might as well be ready to defend himself. But Father Brown remained seated in the corner, his round face troubled, his eyes cast downward as though he bore the weight of knowledge too heavy to reveal. And then came the first sign that the prophecy was not an idle utterance, but a truth unraveling before their eyes. A strange letter was found, slipped beneath the door when no one was looking. The handwriting was jagged, almost desperate, and it contained only one line. "The priest is right. Tonight, one of us must die." The letter passed from hand to hand, its words searing fear into every soul that read them. Who had written it? Why deliver such a chilling confirmation of Father Brown's words? And more importantly, if someone already knew the truth, did that mean the murder was not only planned, but inevitable? Suspicion began to fall on everyone at once. Every movement, every glance, every stammered word seemed like evidence of guilt. The victim begged Father Brown to take back his words, to declare that he had been mistaken. But the priest only sighed. "I cannot take back what I have seen," he whispered. "The truth will not unwrite itself." As the night deepened, small revelations began to surface. Father Brown found a torn scrap of paper in the hearth, part of a letter that spoke of debts unpaid, of betrayal buried under years of silence. He uncovered a hidden bottle of poison, tucked away in a satchel, and then he overheard a whispered threat exchanged in the shadows of the hall. But instead of simplifying the mystery, each discovery only made the matter worse. Every clue pointed in a different direction, and each one suggested a darker motive than the last. It became impossible to know who to fear most. The first big reveal came not from Father Brown's lips, but from the victim themselves. Shaking, nearly in tears, they confessed before the entire room that they had been living under a secret threat for years. Someone had vowed to destroy them, not through public accusation, but through silence, waiting for the moment when the blade could fall unseen. Their confession made the room gasp, but it also shifted suspicion again. If someone had promised long ago to see them dead, then perhaps Father Brown's prophecy was not supernatural at all, but the slow fulfillment of a hidden vendetta. And yet, even as the victims spoke, Father Brown studied the faces around the room, not with shock, but with sorrow, as though he already knew who among them carried the intent, and though his heart was breaking at the inevitability of it. By midnight, the storm outside had risen, rain lashing against the windows, thunder rattling the panes. No one dared to sleep. They sat in silence, waiting for the prophecy to claim its price. Then came a sound that froze them all, a scream, sharp and desperate, echoing through the hall. When they rushed to the source, they found not a body, but a mark left in blood on the wall. A single word scrawled with trembling fingers. Foretold. The villagers panicked, demanding answers from Father Brown, but he gave them none. His silence was worse than any accusation. His stillness suggested that he knew the truth already, but could not or would not speak it. The room became a trap of suspicion. Every friendship turned brittle, every smile false. People began to wonder, had Father Brown truly foreseen the murder, or had he himself planted the idea so that fear would drive the act into being? Was the prophecy a warning or a weapon? By dawn, nothing had been resolved. No one had died, and yet everyone felt marked, as though death had only been delayed. Father Brown stood before them, his expression grave. He did not comfort, he did not explain. Instead, he said quietly, "The prophecy has not ended. It is only waiting." And with those words, the room broke apart into chaos. Some fled, others wept, and the victim themselves collapsed in fear. But Father Brown only walked to the door, placed his hand on the frame, and said, "I know who carries the blade, but if I speak it, the truth will destroy more than the murder itself. Let it remain unsaid." The chapter closed not with resolution, but with terror, left hanging in the air. The prophecy remained alive, unfulfilled, but unstoppable. And the audience, like the villagers in the inn, would be left wondering not if the murder would happen, but when. Chapter 7. Father Brown warned. Too late. The letter arrived drenched in blood, though no body had yet been found. Father Brown stared at it in silence, his round face drained of color, as if he had just seen a ghost walk across the rectory floor. It was not the blood itself that made his hands tremble, but the words scrawled across the paper. "I warned you, but you listened too late. Now one will die before midnight." In that single moment, the ordinary rhythm of village life collapsed into an abyss of dread, and Father Brown knew that he was staring into the mouth of a prophecy fulfilled too late to stop. The thought alone was enough to freeze the soul, and yet the horror had only just begun. The mystery began not with the discovery of a crime, but with the shadow of one. The village was still, the evening bells ringing across empty lanes, and every shuttered window seemed to hide more than candlelight. The air was thick with silence, broken only by whispers behind doors, fearful, hushed words about omens, visions, and the priest, who seemed to know too much. Father Brown, ever calm, walked slowly through the village square, his eyes lowered, yet his mind blazing with questions. Why had the warning come to him, and why only now, when nothing could be undone? It was not murder itself that haunted him. It was the knowledge that he might have been the only one who could have prevented it, if only he had acted sooner. That unbearable weight pressed down on him with every step. The case itself was too complicated to grasp in simple terms. On the surface, there was only a letter and a threat, but beneath it lay tangled threads of secrets, rivalries, and unseen hands moving in the dark. Everyone in the village carried a shadow, an unspoken sin, a hidden fear, and Father Brown felt the net tightening around them all. The more he tried to unravel it, the more tightly it seemed to twist, like a rope choking out light. He sought answers in prayer, in scripture, in quiet contemplation, but each time the image returned to him, a body falling, unseen, in the dead of night. It was not a vision sent to comfort or guide him, but a torment meant to strip away his faith in reason. As the hours passed, the suspense grew unbearable. Father Brown began to follow faint traces, footsteps in the mud that vanished halfway down a path, candlelight in the window of a house long abandoned, voices echoing in the chapel when no one was inside. The signs were not clues, but fragments of something darker, designed to mislead as much as reveal. Each step forward left him more disoriented, more certain that he was being drawn into a labyrinth where every passage led to fear. His discovery came not with triumph, but with horror. Someone in the village had planned this death for months, and every villager he trusted might have been part of it. The crime was not random. It was orchestrated, and worse, it was personal. The first big reveal struck like thunder on a clear day. Father Brown uncovered a hidden diary buried beneath the floorboards of the rectory, one that did not belong to him, but to someone who had entered his study long ago. The diary recorded his every move, his sermons, his confessions heard, his solitary walks at night. Someone had been watching him, not for days or weeks, but for years, writing down every word he spoke as though collecting proof against him. And at the end of the diary, a final entry chilled his blood. When he fails to act, he will condemn another to death. That is his punishment. It was not merely about a murder. It was about him. The killer had not only chosen their victim, they had chosen their witness. This realization shattered any sense of safety. Father Brown could no longer look at the faces of his flock without suspicion. Who had written it? Who knew him so well, so intimately, that they could mimic his own thoughts on paper? He tried to reason it through, but every answer turned into another question. If the killer wanted him to carry guilt, why had they waited until now? If he was meant to intervene, why was the warning sent when no time remained? It was a cruelty beyond reason, a punishment not of flesh, but of spirit. And in that cruelty, Father Brown saw the face of evil more terrifying than any simple murder. The deeper he probed, the darker it became. One night, he stood alone in the chapel, the candlelight throwing long shadows against the walls, and he whispered aloud, "Who are you?" The silence that answered him was almost unbearable. Then, faintly, he heard the creak of a pew behind him, as if someone unseen had shifted in their seat. He turned, but the church was empty. The air was cold, as if someone had just slipped away, leaving only the echo of their presence. That night, Father Brown realized that the killer had been close enough to hear his prayers, close enough to sit in the same pew, and yet far enough to remain invisible. The dread reached its peak when he finally pieced together what the letter truly meant. Midnight was not a time, it was a symbol. The death foretold was not only a body, but the destruction of faith, the breaking of trust, the unraveling of his very purpose. He understood then that the killer's design was not to slay just one person, but to poison the entire village with suspicion and despair. Every villager became both suspect and potential victim, and Father Brown stood at the center of it all, powerless to prevent what was already set in motion. And then came the cliffhanger, so sharp it cut through reason itself. As the clock struck midnight, a scream echoed across the village. Father Brown rushed into the dark, guided only by the sound, his breath catching in his throat. But when he arrived at the source, there was no body, only another letter nailed to the church door. It read, "You were warned. You failed. And now the dead will never rest." Father Brown's hands shook as he held it, his mind spiraling into questions that could not be answered. Who was dead if no body had been found? Was it possible that the murder had already taken place in some unseen way, in some place beyond the living? Or was this a game without end, one designed to keep him and the village forever on the edge of madness? In the final scene, Father Brown stood beneath the crucifix, whispering to the silent figure above him. "I know who did it," he said, his voice steady yet hollow. "But the truth will never be told. Not tonight. Perhaps not. Ever." His words hung in the air, unanswered, and the darkness seemed to lean in closer, listening. The mystery remained unsolved, not because the answer did not exist, but because it was too terrible to reveal. And so the chapter closed, not with resolution, but with unbearable tension, the kind that leaves the heart pounding and the mind refusing to rest. The audience is left staring into the same abyss as Father Brown, trapped between the need to know and the terror of what knowing might mean. Chapter 8. The Death Father. Brown predicted. The night. Father Brown whispered that death was coming. No one believed him, until the church bell tolled before dawn, and a body was found beneath its shadow, exactly as he had foretold. The horror of it was not in the corpse itself, but in the unbearable fact that he had seen it before it happened, described it in chilling detail, and yet was powerless to stop it. The villagers whispered of prophecy, of curses, of a priest who carried the dreadful gift of foresight. But Father Brown knew better. Visions were nothing compared to the darker truth that men created their own fates, and his warning had only made the death more inevitable. The evening before the tragedy, Father Brown had sat quietly in the rectory, a candle burning low, his mind troubled by a vision that was not of heaven, but of blood. He had seen the churchyard cloaked in moonlight, and there, between the leaning stones, a figure falling, collapsing as though struck down by an invisible hand. The tolling of the church bell had rung in his ears like a cruel announcement. When the parishioners came to him, asking why he looked so pale, he had merely murmured that something dreadful was stirring in the village, something none of them would wish to face. But by then, it was already too late. At midnight, the streets lay silent, though the silence was more oppressive than peace. Somewhere in the village, a lantern flickered, its weak glow trailing across shuttered windows. Father Brown walked alone, feeling as though each corner he turned was leading him closer to some unseen horror. He passed the baker's shop, shuttered tight, and the public house, where a single window glowed faintly with the last embers of revelry. Yet in the shadows he felt a presence, watching, lingering, waiting for the moment when the prophecy would fulfill itself. He tried to tell himself it was only nerves, only the echo of his own mind, but something in his chest whispered that the night itself was conspiring against him. And then, the scream. It cut through the night like a blade, sharp and sudden, and every door in the lane rattled. Father Brown froze, his breath caught in his throat, for it was the scream he had heard in his vision, the same dreadful cry that ended in silence too quickly. He rushed toward the churchyard, stumbling across the cobbles, and there, under the shadow of the great bell tower, the body lay sprawled on the grass. Lifeless eyes stared at the sky, the mouth twisted in terror, as though the last sight it had seen was too dreadful to comprehend. And above them, the church bell swung once, groaning with a sound that did not belong to mortal hands, for no rope had been pulled, and yet it rang. The villagers gathered, some clutching shawls, others lanterns, all with faces pale in the ghostly light. Whispers erupted like the hiss of snakes. Father Brown said it. He said this would happen. And they looked at him, not as a savior, but as if he were cursed, as though by naming death he had conjured it into being. The priest knelt beside the body, trembling hands reaching toward the cooling skin, his lips moving in a silent prayer. But his eyes were not fixed on the dead. They were searching the darkness beyond the graveyard, as though he knew the killer was not far, perhaps even among those who stood watching with false expressions of shock. The mystery began to twist upon itself almost instantly. The victim had been seen alive not an hour before, speaking cheerfully with a neighbor, and yet now he lay as though struck down by some unseen doom. There was no wound, no weapon, no trace of struggle, and yet the terror etched into his face was so absolute that the villagers whispered of poison, or worse, a curse. Father Brown, however, shook his head slowly. He knew what they feared, but fear was always a mask, hiding a truth far more human and far more terrible. The deeper he looked, the more the night itself seemed to mock him. In the dead man's pocket was a folded paper, smudged with ink, the words half blurred, yet enough remained to chill his soul. He said the bell would toll. He said, "I would die tonight." Father Brown's hand trembled as he held it. Who had written those words? The victim himself, confessing to some premonition? Or had another hand placed it there, cruelly planting the suggestion of doom in his mind, ensuring that when death came, it would look like prophecy fulfilled? The more he asked, the less the villagers could answer. Each testimony contradicted the other. Some swore they saw the man walking home alone. Others whispered he had been followed. A woman insisted she had heard him crying in the street, though her husband silenced her quickly, his face too pale to be innocent. Father Brown watched them all carefully, his eyes lingering on every twitch, every nervous swallow, every glance that avoided the dead man on the ground. Someone among them knew more than they dared admit. But the truth was buried beneath layers of lies and fear. By dawn, the churchyard was heavy with silence, but in Father Brown's mind, the night had not ended. He paced the rectory, his thoughts twisting upon themselves. Was the vision he had seen truly divine, or had it been planted in his mind by someone, who wanted him to bear the weight of foreknowledge? Had he been manipulated, his warning twisted into a weapon, ensuring that when the man died, all would look upon him as cursed? He could feel the suspicion in the villagers' eyes, growing like a storm cloud, turning him from priest to prophet, from prophet to accomplice. And then came the first big reveal, one so dark that it tore apart what little certainty remained. The bell rope in the tower had been cut clean through, severed so that no man could have rung it that night. And yet, the bell had swung. Father Brown stood in the tower, staring at the frayed rope, his breath quickening. If no hand had rung it, then the death itself was marked by something unseen, something deliberate. Someone had planned not only the murder, but the sound that would seal it in superstition. Someone had wanted the village to believe in prophecy, to believe in curses, and to believe, most of all, that Father Brown himself was bound to them. But who? And why? He searched through the victim's past, uncovering whispers of debts unpaid, of secrets too dark to confess, of enemies that smiled in daylight but sharpened their knives at night. Yet each secret only led to another. Each answer dissolved into a darker question. Was the death meant to silence the man, or to condemn Father Brown? Was the bell tolling for the victim, or was it tolling for him? By evening, Father Brown sat alone in the church, the shadows long and cold around him. He could hear footsteps behind him, though no one was there. He could hear a voice whispering his name, though no lips moved. And in the silence that followed, he knew one thing with terrible clarity: The death he had predicted was not the last. The bell had tolled once, but it would toll again. And then, the final cliffhanger. As he rose to leave, a slip of parchment fell from the altar as though placed there by unseen hands. He bent to read it, and his blood ran cold. Scrawled in the same ink as the paper in the victim's pocket were 5 dreadful words. "Tomorrow, it will be you." Father Brown closed his eyes, whispering a prayer, though his voice shook. He knew who had written it. He knew who had turned prophecy into death. But as the candle guttered beside him, he also knew this truth would never be spoken aloud. For some secrets, once revealed, kill not just the guilty, but everyone who dares to hear them. Chapter 9. Father Brown saw it coming. The murder happened exactly where Father Brown had said it would, and at the precise hour he had whispered in dread, yet not a single soul believed him until the scream cut the night in half. The chill of those words spread through the parish like a sickness, crawling under door frames, sliding along the pews, and clinging to every silent corner where shadows lurked. For days, whispers had passed through the village, uneasy laughter masking the truth that none dared admit aloud. Father Brown had predicted a death. Not in jest, not in the fanciful way of fortune-tellers or charlatans, but with a solemn heaviness that seemed almost like mourning before the crime had even taken place. And when the scream came, when the body was found, it was as if time itself had conspired with the priest's prophecy to prove how useless human denial could be against inevitability. The case was already too tangled to make sense. The victim, a man of no particular importance to the wider world, had nevertheless carried with him a history that refused to stay buried. Old debts, old quarrels, old secrets, threads Father Brown had seen woven together in strange and sinister ways. Days earlier, he had warned someone in hushed tones, but his warning had been dismissed as the ramblings of a weary clergyman too accustomed to funerals. The tragedy was that Father Brown had not been mistaken. He had seen it coming, not through clairvoyance, but through a dreadful understanding of human nature, that frail and corrupted clockwork mechanism ticking away inside every soul. When the police arrived, suspicion clung to the air thicker than incense. Too many motives floated in the room, and yet none seemed clear enough to seize upon. The dead man's pocket watch was smashed, its hands frozen at the very hour Father Brown had mentioned. His last letter, crumpled on the floor, bore half a sentence that ended with a word that looked like "forgive," but no one could be certain. And though the house was locked from within, the footprints outside told of someone who had approached, hesitated, and vanished again into the night. Each witness contradicted the next. A servant swore she heard raised voices just before the scream, while another insisted the house had been silent. A neighbor had seen a lantern moving by the window, but the victim's family claimed he had retired early and extinguished every light. Father Brown listened, his face pale, his eyes distant, as though he was both present and elsewhere at once. It was not the murder itself that disturbed him most. It was the sickening familiarity of it all, the sense that he was standing in the middle of a play whose lines had been spoken before, whose ending he already knew but could not prevent. As the investigation deepened, the confusion only thickened. Each clue seemed to cancel out the one before. A letter hinted at blackmail, but the supposed blackmailer denied even knowing the victim. A half-empty glass of wine suggested poison, yet no trace was found. A locked drawer was forced open, only to reveal nothing but a child's broken toy, a relic that seemed out of place, irrelevant, unless, perhaps, It wasn't. Father Brown touched the toy with unsteady fingers, his silence more unnerving than any explanation could have been. What no one else noticed, but what Father Brown saw immediately, was the way fear had seeped into everyone's eyes. Not fear of the crime itself, but fear of being known, fear of being exposed. It was as though the murder had reached into their private chambers, pulled at their curtains, and threatened to drag their own buried sins into the light. The victim had not been universally loved, but neither had he been hated enough for such an act. And yet, hatred is not the only root of murder. Sometimes it is desperation. Sometimes it is shame. Sometimes it is love, twisted into something unrecognizable. Father Brown knew this all too well. And then came the first shocking reveal. The victim, weeks before his death, had sought out Father Brown in confession. He had spoken of a sin he could not name, a sin too large to forgive, one that walked beside him every night. Father Brown had said nothing of it until now, bound by the seal, but the memory chilled him, for the man had ended that confession with a strange, almost trembling laugh, whispering, "I will not die by my own hand. Someone else will do it for me." Those words shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. Suddenly, no one could be trusted. Did the victim know who wished him dead? Had he invited it, even welcomed it? Had he provoked the very hand that struck him down? The silence in the room turned poisonous, every glance heavy with suspicion, every polite word trembling with hidden malice. Father Brown felt it pressing down like the weight of the confessional itself, the suffocating truth that murder is never just about one life lost, but about the countless threads that bind souls together in guilt and silence. And still, nothing was clear. The smashed watch, the unfinished letter, the broken toy, the vanished footprints, none of it formed a straight line. It was a labyrinth, twisting back upon itself, luring Father Brown deeper into a darkness he wished he had never glimpsed. His warning had not been heeded. His words had fallen into silence. And now, as he stared at the blood-stained floor, he could not escape the thought that perhaps he had not been a prophet at all, but a participant, his very warning pushing fate toward its dreadful fulfillment. The night ended, not with answers, but with a whisper from Father Brown's lips, quiet enough that only the walls seemed to hear. "I saw it coming, but I wish to God I hadn't." And that was when the second scream split the village in two. Chapter 10. The Fate Father. Brown knew they found the body exactly where Father Brown said it would be, before anyone even knew a crime had been committed. The words spread through the village like fire through dry fields, whispered in taverns, muttered in kitchens, spoken in trembling voices in the churchyard. It wasn't just that Father Brown had predicted death before it came, it was that he had named the place, the hour, and even the manner of the victim's last breath, as though fate itself had whispered its secret into his ear. And yet when the horror arrived exactly as he had described, he stood quietly in his cassock, clutching his umbrella, his face pale but unreadable, as though this had not surprised him in the slightest. It was that calmness, cold, unshakable, unsettling, that unsettled even his friends. How could he have known? And worse, why had he said nothing until it was too late? It began with a single line in the parish register, a name half scratched out, as if the ink itself recoiled from recording it. Father Brown's finger had paused on that place, his brows knitting, before he murmured something so soft the verger thought he had misheard. "He won't live to see Sunday." It was Friday, By Saturday evening, the village was no longer whispering. It was shouting in panic, because the man whose name had been smudged was found lifeless in the very shadow of the church tower, his face twisted, his eyes wide in terror, his mouth open as though he had died screaming. The constable demanded answers. The villagers demanded explanations, and yet Father Brown stood quiet, his lips pressed thin. He knew something, too much perhaps, but the more he tried to explain, the more tangled the mystery became. For he hadn't predicted the death as a guess, nor as an accident, but with such precision that it felt like a curse. And when he finally spoke, his words sent shivers down the spine of everyone within earshot. This was no ordinary murder. The hand that killed him was moving long before it struck. Darkness gathered around the case like a storm. Every alibi collapsed under scrutiny. Every friend seemed suddenly a stranger. The man had enemies, yes, but none so vicious as to wish him gone with such ritualistic cruelty. Yet Father Brown, moving quietly from door to door, seemed to know exactly who to question, exactly where to look. He uncovered letters that should have been burned, a locket that should have remained hidden, a debt that should never have been revealed. But for every truth he uncovered, two new lies seemed to sprout, twisting into shapes so grotesque that no one could tell reality from deception anymore. The villagers began to murmur that Father Brown himself was cursed, that perhaps it was not God, but something darker that guided his hand. He knew too much, they whispered. He saw it before it happened. Some swore that they had seen him in the graveyard on Thursday evening, staring at the very patch of earth where the body would, later, be found. Others claimed they heard him muttering prayers in Latin that sounded less like prayers and more like incantations. By Sunday morning, suspicion clung to him as tightly as the fog that rolled through the churchyard. Then came the first great reveal. Though it explained nothing, only deepened the terror. Father Brown held up the victim's pocket watch, cracked and broken, but still ticking faintly. It stopped at the exact time he died, he said softly, yet the gears are moving, backward. No one knew what to make of it. The doctor muttered something about trick mechanics, the constable barked about superstition, but the villagers stared, wide-eyed. A watch running in reverse, a priest predicting death, a man dead in the place foretold. Was it murder or destiny? From that moment, reality itself seemed to tilt sideways. Father Brown's investigation did not ease their minds, but tore them further apart. He spoke to the widow, who trembled under his gaze. He visited the man's business partner, who tried too quickly to cover his own tracks. He lingered longest in the confessional, where whispers slipped through the screen so soft that no one could make them out. But afterward, his face grew heavier and his eyes darker, as though he carried not just secrets, but sins too great for any one man to bear. And yet, he pressed on, even when the danger pressed back. One night, they found him standing in the rectory, the curtains drawn, his hand shaking as he traced a symbol into the condensation on the glass. When asked what it meant, he simply muttered, "The same mark was on the body." But no one else had seen it. No one else had noticed it. It was as though he alone was reading a language written in shadows. By then, the village was terrified not only of the killer, but of Father Brown himself. Could he truly see what no one else could? Was his knowledge divine or damned? Even Flambeau, his old friend, looked at him uneasily. "You say you saw it coming," he told the priest one evening, "but how can a man see death before it arrives unless he walks with it himself?" Father Brown only lowered his gaze and whispered, "Sometimes we carry death with us, long before it touches our skin." Then came the second revelation, and it was worse than the first. Father Brown uncovered a letter, hidden deep within the church archives, dated months before the victim's death. In it, the man had written, "If Father Brown warns you of my end, know this, it was I who brought it upon myself." The entire village reeled. How had he written such a thing? Why had he connected his fate to Father Brown, even before the priest spoke a word? Was this proof of guilt, a suicide note hidden in plain sight? Or was it something darker, something binding them both in a fate neither could escape? The constable demanded Father Brown explain himself. The villagers demanded an answer, but the priest only said, "Some things are written before we are born. We cannot alter them, only watch them unfold." His words struck like a blow, leaving even the bravest trembling. By now, the mystery was no longer who killed the man, but whether the man's death was murder at all or prophecy fulfilled. Father Brown himself seemed caught in the middle, torn between exposing a killer and revealing a fate worse than murder, inevitability. And then the chapter closed with a cliffhanger that no one could shake. Father Brown, standing once more over the grave, his umbrella tapping softly against the earth, whispered so faintly that only Flambeau, standing near, could hear. "This isn't the last. Another death is already written, and it's someone you know." The air froze. The village held its breath, and the mystery swallowed them whole. Would Father Brown reveal the name? Would he prevent the fate he foresaw? Or was it already too late, as it had been before? He knew, and he alone, but his final words left only dread. "I know who will die next, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 11. Father Brown's darkest prophecy revealed. They found the body exactly where Father Brown had said it would be, before the crime had even been committed. The villagers who stood in the fog-drenched churchyard swore their hearts stopped in that moment, because what they saw was not just a corpse, but the very fulfillment of a prophecy whispered in Father Brown's calm, unsettling tone only days before. The air hung heavy, choking, as if time itself had bent to his words. How could a priest, quiet, humble, unassuming, have foreseen a death so precisely, not just the victim, but the hour, the place, and the dreadful silence that would follow? This was no coincidence, and it was no parlor trick. It was something far darker, something that reached into the marrow of everyone who heard him say it. They began to wonder, almost against their will, whether Father Brown had only predicted the crime, or in some dreadful, unholy way had made it inevitable. The problem began, as so many of his cases did, with an unease no one could name. The village had been restless, muttering with gossip of secrets best left buried, and yet no one dared speak them aloud. Whispers carried along the cobbled lanes, strange lights in the woods, a cry in the night, doors left ajar as though someone or something had passed silently through. The tension pressed down, and Father Brown, with his eyes that saw too much, carried the weight of it in silence, until one night, in the parish hall, he simply said, "There will be a death. Not an accident, not an illness, a death laid out like a script, and when it happens, you will all know the truth is nearer than you dare to admit." No one laughed, no one scoffed. They froze, as though he had not spoken words but carved them into stone. And in that silence, the seed of dread was planted. From that moment, every sound in the dark seemed sharper. Every footstep an omen, every passing glance a warning. Who would die? When? And how could Father Brown have known? The villagers tried to convince themselves it was just talk, a priest's attempt at moral persuasion. But the unease gnawed at them, because his tone had not been metaphorical. It had been final, like the toll of a bell that had already rung. Days passed, but instead of easing, the suspense grew. Father Brown was seen walking the edges of the churchyard at midnight, as though mapping the shadows, pausing at a particular corner near the yew tree. His lips moved in prayer, but his eyes were fixed on the ground, as if he could already see blood soaking into the earth. And then it happened. A man, respected but quietly loathed, was found exactly where Father Brown had stood staring. His body sprawled in a grotesque stillness, his face twisted with a horror that suggested he had seen something unspeakable in the last instant of his life. But it was not the death itself that unsettled the village. It was the timing. For Father Brown had whispered only hours earlier, "It will be tonight, when the fog covers the graves and when the clock strikes the hour." And it had, down to the minute. What no one could answer was how he had known. The police came naturally, but their questions seemed almost childlike in the face of such impossible knowledge. How could they interrogate a man whose prophecy had come true? They asked Father Brown outright. Had someone confessed to him, bound by secrecy of the confessional? But his answer only deepened the darkness. No man confesses to a crime before he has committed it, yet some crimes weigh upon the soul long before they are done. What did that mean? Did he know the killer already? Did the killer know that Father Brown had spoken of his act before it was carried out? And if so, why would he proceed, knowing the prophecy would cast suspicion upon him? Unless, of course, that was part of the plan all along. The villagers could no longer separate fate from guilt, prophecy from crime. Had the priest's words planted the seed in the murderer's mind, turning possibility into certainty? Or had he, through some dreadful insight, touched the unseen pattern that wound through every human heart, binding choice to destiny? The line between knowing and causing blurred until it was unbearable. But the darkness did not stop there. For when the body was examined, Father Brown quietly said something that froze the doctor's blood. He murmured, "This is not the end. This is only the first." And with that, the prophecy twisted into something larger, something that stretched beyond one man's death. The villagers realized, with sinking terror, that they were not at the conclusion of a mystery, but at the threshold of one that had only just begun. Father Brown began to walk among them differently now, his eyes resting longer on some faces than others, as though he were measuring the distance between them and the fate he knew awaited. His sermons were not sermons at all, but warnings wrapped in parables. He spoke of wolves in sheep's clothing, of seeds that sprout into thorns, of a hand that strikes twice before it is stilled. And those who listened too closely swore he was no longer preaching from Scripture, but from something deeper, something drawn from the very marrow of the human soul. What unsettled them most was that he never explained. He gave no details, no names. He simply left them suspended in their own fear, forced to wonder if their own hearts contained the crime he had foreseen. And then came the first reveal, a diary, found in the dead man's study, tucked behind false books on a shelf no one had touched in years. A diary written in a hand both precise and fevered, speaking of debts, betrayals, and a pact so vile no one dared read it aloud. The last entry was dated the very day before his death. But the final line, he knows, he sees, he will speak, raised questions that turned every eye toward Father Brown. Had the dead man known he would be killed? Had he feared Father Brown's knowledge more than the murderer himself? And most damning of all, what exactly did Father Brown see? By now the villagers could not trust anything, not even themselves. Every friendship strained under suspicion. Every household locked itself against shadows that seemed to move. And always, at the center, the priest, whose calm silence pressed harder on their nerves than 1,000 accusations. The tension built toward breaking, until one night, as the wind tore through the churchyard, Father Brown stood again in the pulpit and said, with quiet certainty, "The second death will not be a murder, but it will be blood on someone's hands all the same." And the silence that followed was worse than any scream. The villagers knew now that they were not dealing with a puzzle that could be solved with evidence or reason. They were dealing with prophecy, with a priest who saw not only deeds, but the shadow of deeds before they were done. And the terror of it was that prophecy, once spoken, could not be escaped. The story ends here, though not with an ending. For even as the villagers trembled, Father Brown lowered his gaze, folded his hands, and said the words that ensured no one in that church could ever sleep soundly again. "I know who will die next, and I know who will live to carry the weight of it. But the truth will never be told." Chapter 12. The Murder. Father Brown expected the first scream, tore through the night, not as a warning, but as a confirmation, because Father Brown had already whispered hours before that someone in the room would not live to see the morning. It was not prophecy, nor luck, nor madness. It was inevitability dressed in human flesh. And when the cry came, every soul in the house realized too late that the priest's quiet voice had never sounded more terrifyingly true. The house itself seemed to hold its breath after the sound. Every clock ticked too loudly, every shadow seemed to stretch longer, and the silence that followed pressed down like the weight of a coffin lid. The murder was not unexpected. It was the very thing Father Brown had dreaded and predicted. Yet the fact that he had foreseen it, the way he had spoken as if death was already standing in the corner, was what unnerved them all. Who was dead? Who had killed? Or worse, who had allowed themselves to become part of a fate so darkly inevitable? Father Brown did not rush. He never did. Instead, he folded his hands, his expression grave, and walked toward the sound with the air of a man not surprised but resigned, as though his feet were carrying him toward a truth he had long prepared himself to see. The others followed, some whispering, some trembling, their fear mounting not merely from the crime itself, but from the suffocating thought. If Father Brown knew this would happen, what else might he already know? A body lay, sprawled across the library floor, the lamplight flickering on still open eyes. The victim had not gone silently. The position of the hands, the overturned chair, the scattered papers, all spoke of a struggle. And yet there was something even more dreadful than the sight of the corpse itself, the sense that the murder had already been written, as if the killer had acted out a script composed long before tonight. Father Brown's expression was unreadable. He lowered his head and murmured, almost to himself, "So it has happened, just as it was meant to." But what did he mean? No one dared ask. Instead, they stood in silence, their gazes darting between the body and the priest, whose calmness was more frightening than the crime. One woman clutched at her rosary, Another man muttered something about curses, about omens. Yet Father Brown simply observed, as though searching not for who had killed, but why the murder had been so certain. The problem began to unfold in pieces that only confused those who tried to follow. The victim had enemies, yes, but also friends who seemed far too shaken to be innocent. A glass of wine stood half-finished near the fireplace, though the victim was not known to drink. The window latch was unfastened, though it had been locked just an hour earlier. A watch on the dead man's wrist ticked steadily, but the clock on the mantel had been stopped at the exact moment of death. Were these clues or distractions planted to drive them into madness? Father Brown bent to pick up a slip of paper that had fallen near the body. His eyes scanned it only briefly before he folded it away, slipping it into his sleeve. "This is not about opportunity," he said softly. "It's about intent. The murder was never about chance. It was promised." The others looked at one another, more bewildered than before. Promised to whom? By whom? And why would Father Brown speak as though the killing was inevitable, something preordained by forces unseen? The night grew darker outside, the wind clawing against the shutters like a warning they could not escape. Father Brown's investigation seemed to bring no comfort, only deeper unease. He asked questions that pierced like knives. "Where were you when I gave my warning earlier? Why did you not heed it? What did you hope would happen tonight?" Each inquiry seemed to expose not facts, but fears, and the people trapped within the house felt themselves unraveling under his gaze. Then came the first reveal, something so shocking that those who heard it staggered backward, as though the floor itself had cracked. Father Brown spoke of a letter, a single page written weeks before the crime, in which the victim had described their own death in chilling detail. The letter contained not only the manner of death, but the exact hour. And worse, it had been sent to more than one person in the very room. "He told you," Father Brown said, his voice low and grim. "He told at least some of you how he would die, and yet none of you stopped it. Perhaps," he added, pausing to look into their pale, frightened faces, "because you believed it was meant to happen." The revelation shattered what little composure remained. If the victim had foretold his own death, then what was this? Murder? Or fate? Had the killer simply carried out an expectation everyone else was too terrified to challenge? The room seemed colder now, as though the fire could no longer give warmth. Suspicion turned inward, clawing at them like invisible hands. As Father Brown pressed further, the lines between truth and illusion blurred. Each person swore they had no part in it, yet each had a reason, an inheritance to gain, a scandal to cover, a secret to protect. He listened, nodding, never accusing directly, yet somehow making each soul feel as though they were already condemned. They began to question not just each other, but themselves. Could one of them have done it and forgotten? Could fate truly twist a person into acting without knowing? The priest's eyes lingered on the window, the curtains swaying gently, though the air was still. "There is something you all fear more than guilt," he said slowly. "You fear that this death was not chosen by human hands at all, but written in the shadows long before tonight. And if that is true, then perhaps none of you are safe." The words dropped into the silence, like stones into a deep well. No one moved. No one breathed. Because it was not just the murder they were forced to face now. It was the possibility that the killing was only the beginning, that Father Brown's prophecy had not ended with one death. And then, with deliberate calm, He closed his eyes and whispered the words that froze every heart in the room. I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. The statement left them in a state of unbearable torment. To know that the priest had seen the answer, to feel the certainty radiating from him, but to be denied the resolution, it was more than mystery. It was cruelty born of necessity, because to reveal the truth, perhaps, would mean breaking the fragile line that kept the rest of them alive. Or worse, it would mean confirming that fate had chosen its victims already, and that nothing they could do would stop what was coming next. The storm outside raged louder, and the night pressed heavier upon the house. They waited, prayed, feared, but none dared leave. For if Father Brown had been right about the first death, then perhaps he was right about what was still to come. And somewhere in the stillness, each one began to ask themselves the question that gnawed at their sanity: who would be next?